From the New York Institute for the Humanities, I'm Eric Banks. Music critic Ben Ratliff has been thinking about musical virtuosity for the past several years, and he's joined us today to talk about the concept. Ratliff is the author of 4 books, including Every Song Ever, 20 Ways to Listen, and Coltrane, Story of a Sound. For 20 years, he was a pop and jazz critic at the New York Times, and in 2016, he became an Institute Fellow. Ben, welcome. You've been writing and thinking a lot about virtuosity lately. Why don't you give us a little bit of an idea about how you got interested in such a concept?
Well, it first, virtuosity was a chapter in this book I wrote called Every Song Ever, where I was trying to figure out different through lines to create through music in order to listen more widely. It's just like different strategies for broad listening in order to defeat the algorithm.
To defeat the algorithm? What do you mean by defeating the algorithm?
Well, anybody who uses a streaming service for music like Spotify knows by now that they are being reduced to a data set, and they are most likely being fed music that Spotify or the algorithms being used by Spotify predicts that you will like. And this idea is really interesting, but also troubling to me, because for me, listening is such a personal thing. I mean, it's like, it's what made me who I am. You know, I mean, it's like discovering music and figuring out what you respond to and making connections on your own from song to song in any direction is how you sort of create your personality. And it influences everything, you know, how you talk and walk and dress and fall in love and think and everything. So I wrote Every Song Ever thinking of 20 different ways, sort of filters for listening, ways to listen. And one of them was the idea of virtuosity, listening for virtuosity.
So is it listening for a set of performances that you think exemplify virtuosity?
The idea of virtuosity, whether that idea is real or not.
Mm-hmm.
And, I mean, the chapters in the book were not very long. They were essayistic meditations.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea stayed with me a little bit. I didn't do anything about it. But then the Townsend Center at UC Berkeley reached out and said that they asked if I wanted to do a lecture about virtuosity.
Oh, specifically about virtuosity. That's what they were interested in.
It was their idea, and it came from having read the book. And I think that they figured rightly that it's a big, slippery idea.
Whenever I hear the word virtuosity, I feel a little bit like Barbara Kruger or Godard, and they're quoting other people. I'm not sure whether to reach for my checkbook or a gun. And I think you have that same kind of relationship to virtuosity.
Well, it's a word that I hear a lot from people who are trying to sell me something.
Mm-hmm.
It's like power from a blind committee. You don't know where that power comes from.
Yeah.
You don't really know what it's all about. What is a virtuoso?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it depends on who you're talking to. And so for people to withhold the term virtuoso virtuoso these days just sort of means really good.
Yeah.
Sort of means great,
Yeah.
But to withhold that term for some musicians and to use it purposefully with others almost seems like an abuse of power, So more and more, as I have come to realize this, I try not to use the word, although I'm sort of like a recovering addict about it. I mean, I used it a lot. The thing is, there's a space, there's an idea that requires a word. And virtuoso is a sort of unfortunate word at this point.
Mm-hmm.
But I used it anyway and was very unhappy with myself afterwards. Part of the difficulty of the word is that it has a few distinct uses. One is just like a sort of cold excellence, like you meet the demands of complicated music, and you meet it clearly and confidently. So if you're playing a certain kind of European classical music repertoire list, for example, which has a lot of complicated fingerings and fast flourishes, you play it and you play it well, I suppose you're at the level of a virtuoso. And virtuosos thought of in that way can be cultivated. They can be created. And that's how, you got to do that in order to have a concert career. And that's a sort of, I don't have a great mental association with those kinds of players. Like Mozart famously called a pianist a mere mechanicus.
Uh-huh.
It's like when you think of a mere mechanicus, you think of like a cold virtuoso. But then there are musicians who almost seem like they've grown their bodies around an instrument, or like it becomes just part of their bodies, becomes an extra appendage. To say that they make playing the instrument sound easy is almost there, but not quite. It's just like they get to what they want absolutely directly. No messing around. They just do it. It's like the Chuck Berry line, he could play a guitar like ringing a bell.
Right.
And I have seen people like that, and you have that feeling of like, oh, what it would be like to be that kind of. But then there's a kind of musician who is technically excellent and blah, 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 but has something else, like something beyond instrumental excellence, some kind of remainder, something that you just don't know what it is. You don't know how to break it down. There's something beyond that level of mastery. And those people are called virtuosos too. So hence my confusion.
Well, there's one place in the Virginia Quarterly essay where you write, I wonder whether the first virtuosic performances we really noticed might be the most satisfactory ones we hear in our lives, or most satisfactory one we hear in our lives, which is a fascinating thought, this kind of idea of a threshold experience, and it's almost an apex of listening very early in your formative experience.
Sure.
Do you have a recollection of what that might have been for you?
Yes. Jimi Hendrix.
Oh, really?
I mean, I don't know, at the age of 11 or something. I mean, I'd certainly heard musicians by that point who could really play. But yeah, this is the record Electric Ladyland. And it might have been the tune called Come On, which I mentioned somewhere in the essay. He was one of those musicians who it sounds like the guitar was part of his body. Everything came out in one fluid motion, and there was something beyond that. And maybe even a sense of like something's passing through him. Like whatever it is, it's coming from some other source.
There's a sense of grace or something.
Grace is a really good word. Yeah. Something else, some other quality. And I remember feeling, how does somebody do that? How is that possible? I couldn't really even imagine the steps taken toward getting to that level. It's just beautiful.
It's something you can't really learn. I mean, it's not a sense of perfection, but the aspect of it is almost of that type, which means that you can't work your way to perfection. It's either perfection or not perfection.
Yeah.
I think that's why grace is maybe a good word to think about in that context. You either have it or you don't.
Right. Grace is a good word. In the Afro-Latin tradition, they use the word ashe. They don't really talk about virtuosos. Yeah, they just don't really talk about virtuosos. But this word ashe, which is a sort of religious sense of grace, is important.
Yeah.
So,
well, going back to the Jimi Hendrix experience, the experience of Jimi Hendrix and the experience of the Jimi Hendrix experience, were you already learning an instrument at that point, or could we say that's the date that the critic was born?
That's a good question.
I mean, do we have to have an experience of making music in order to appreciate what it means to be a virtuoso? In the sense of like struck by the thunderbolt?
No, I wouldn't go so far as to say that. I mean, I just, because I know functioning music critics who don't play an instrument. And I'm sure that they have thoughts about virtuosity. So who am I to say that they can't or wouldn't?
True, but it's hard to think of the best like art critics as not at some point in their lives being painters, for example. And there's always that sort of tension between, knowing an instrument, knowing what it means to sing, knowing what it means to read music and thinking about it.
Yeah.
And feeling what you can't do.
Knowing what it means to sing. Yeah, that. Or even better, knowing what it means to sing and have somebody else listening to you.
Yeah.
That's important too. So I was a guitar player, but of no, distinction. But just to know how it feels to have an instrument in your hands and make a sound to your own satisfaction, to spend time just playing one note or one phrase over and over, that kind of thing, sure. I think it softens you up. It makes it easier to think about concepts like virtuosity.
I'm not sure if you would want to refer to this as a virtuoso painter. It's certainly a virtuoso performance. There was a famous painter from the 19th century, an English painter named Edwin Landseer, who was especially famous for painting circus animals and zoo animals. But he was ambidextrous, and he could paint. He would begin executing a painting with both hands at the same time, one on the right-hand corner, one on the left-hand corner with his left hand, and would paint so that the canvas would be completed in the center. He would apparently do this as a kind of trick at parties as well. And you could see how that would be just, so annoying and such an awful display of technique. But I think it sort of gets to the idea about what it means to be the mere virtuoso.
Yeah. The idea of virtuosity being, vulgar. That's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I noticed that you've used the word vulgar in proximity to virtuosity in several places. And vulgarity is a really interesting word, too, to talk about, because you have to say, well, what exactly do you mean by vulgar?
I suppose excellence being used as mere entertainment, the idea of a facility with an instrument that's just kind of given away cheaply, just turning on the tap and letting it come out, being cheaper as opposed to struggling to find the right note and to locate, the precise, purposeful emotion somehow for that note or that kind of thing.
So arpeggios are not always ipso facto vulgar.
I mean, I don't have a hard and fast opinion about this, because I love hearing some musicians who have incredible facility and can go all over the place. I love melisma. I love melismatic singers. Kind of the more the better. Yeah, for me, because if you're going to do it a little, why not do it a lot? And there's something I put in the book, Every Song Ever. Bob Dylan was quoted saying something really grouchy about the singer Marcia Ambrosius singing the national anthem before a fight. Yeah, and there was a lot of melisma in her version, and he was saying she bent that song out of shape. She made it unrecognizable. You don't do that with a song that important. You know? And I just thought, no, that's exactly what you do with a song that important. All that fancy stuff is a form of bending it and altering it, and it's not necessarily cheap. Yeah. Well, I remember around that point in that essay in the book, or that section in the book, you talked about a reaction to a certain kind of virtuosity that you said you felt condescended to. I think that was the verb that you used, was condescended to. Okay. So this is the moment to say that sometimes I feel that virtuosity, essentially, a widely agreed upon definition of virtuosity, is one in which the musician is essentially saying through the instrument, you be quiet now. Like, I know what I'm doing. Like, I got it. I can take it from here. It essentially shuts down. It shuts something down. Shuts down the listener, rather than opening things up. And most of the time, I don't like that feeling. I feel like I'm being told to stop thinking. I said that when I did this as a lecture in California, and then afterwards, somebody came up to me and said, "Yeah, I hear what you're saying, but some people like to be dominated." And I thought, yeah, that's true. That's true. And I am sure part of my Jimi Hendrix rapture as a kid was something of that was in there, like, I want this person to just steamroller me. I want this person to tell me I'm better than you can ever imagine. I think it's hard to think of a kind of example of virtuosity that doesn't have that aspect to it. I mean, however, maybe this is a good time for us to say we've said a lot of things about the kind of negative connotations of the word, or the negative extensions of the word. Maybe give us a few examples of something that counts for you as virtuosity, or maybe this would be a good time to talk about a couple of musicians who might exemplify virtuosic performance and something close that's non-virtuosic. Two examples come to mind. One where, and they're sort of in the same genre. They are in the same genre. One where I think virtuoso, and one where I don't think virtuoso. I think, wow, that is just a great human being. Like, I don't know what the hell that person is doing, but I like it. The first one is a flamenco singer called La Niña de la Puebla, and here she is singing in the 1920s in Sevilla, accompanied by a guitarist, a great guitarist, Sabicas. And she, her technique is legible. So that's Niña de la Puebla. And then the other example I would use to contrast it is La Niña de los Penes, another flamenco singer who is often talked about as, the greatest female flamenco singer. And this recording is, I think, from the 40s, also just voice and accompanied by a guitarist. And for what it's worth, she is the singer referred to in Lorca's essay about duende, Lorca's famous essay about duende, where he talks about it in the context of flamenco singing. And he revered her. But so here is La Niña de los Penes singing.
Ay, el corazón de pena encontrado, ha pasado el corazón de pena encontrado, ha pasado.
So you hear both of those and you think, what's the difference?
Yeah, what is the difference? Tell us the difference.
In the first one, I hear articulation. I hear skills, being used in very specific ways. Separation between notes, control.
Sure.
And I don't know, the word classicism keeps coming to mind, but just some sort of sense of like, this can be sorted and measured, And then with La Niña de los Penes, I just think there's much more struggle for every note. You don't know where we don't know where each note is going. There's a lot more that's seems unquantifiable. This is not to say that that she is not equally skilled as La Niña de la Puebla. These are both incredibly skilled musicians with their own vocabulary. They know what they're doing, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not saying one is learned and one is intuitive. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying that in the case of the second thing we heard, I just don't think of the word virtuosity. It just doesn't occur to me. I may be influenced by the Lorca essay from having read it. And all his talk about how the best way to sing flamenco is to have sort of like the spirit of death sort of like fly out of your mouth, And it's all about death. And I guess my associations with that song is that, something external may be passing through her. She's laying herself open for something to happen. She herself might not even know exactly where each note is gonna land, At least that's the impression I'm getting.
Yeah.
She's such a skilled singer that she may know exactly where every note is gonna land. But there was a time when we were both listening to a lot of Ricky Skaggs.
Yes, absolutely.
Would you ever listen to somebody like that who could just tear it up, let's say in a bluegrass context, and feel almost headachy?
Yes. Definitely. In fact, I think, and this is one thing I wanted to ask you about, I think there are certain genres that really do promote virtuosity. They prize it in a certain way, and they validate it in a certain way, and it can become quite tedious.
Although the funny thing is that, if we're going to talk about where the term came from or where it really started to be used more widely, it was in the first half of the 19th century, at the time of Paganini and Liszt.
The Napoleon of the piano.
Yeah. And Liszt, especially, he was a composer.
Yeah.
Absolutely, like a great composer and a star performer. And people would come to see him. Well, these were the early days of the traveling star.
Yeah.
The traveling solo star. So he would sweep through town and just like tear it up, and he'd play concerts or salons or whatever, and people would think that he was possessed by the devil, and he created a whole this vocabulary of stagecraft about how to enter the space before sitting down at the piano, and what he would do, and how he would throw his gloves on the floor, or like dust off the piano bench with his handkerchief, or the way he would fold his coat somewhere, or and then start to play. And when he'd get really riled up, he would lift off the piano bench, and all these things drove people like into a frenzy.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And it's like he altered the temperature of the room, sort of thing. And
well, you compared him to Jerry Lee Lewis, and kind of a little bit tongue in cheek, I think. But
I mean, the accounts of seeing Liszt play are so great. Like they're so much fun to read, because these people are just they're trying to come to terms with what they've just seen, and they're totally overheated and overblown, these accounts. But you get the sense that they really were changed somehow by the experience. Maybe they fell in love a little bit.
Yeah.
And I think maybe they got the sense that here's a guy who entered a space and really commanded it in a weird way. And that's the connection I get with Jerry Lee Lewis, that when I have seen him play, I mean, I started seeing him play way past his prime.
But that was only when he was in his 90s.
Yeah, but he had the weird power to make everybody in the room think that he was looking at them, or even through them. There was like a sense of danger of being in the room with him.
Yeah.
Like anything could happen at any time.
Yeah.
And there is virtuosity in the Lisztian sense. Virtuosity extends to all the performative aspects, how you create that tension in the room. And Jerry Lee Lewis has that. And he would lift off the piano bench like Liszt and shake his long hair. And I think that probably Jimi Hendrix is totally in the tradition of Liszt.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting comparison. I mean, you certainly think about, it's very hard to draw up a mental picture of Jimi Hendrix that doesn't have him on stage doing something to an instrument that has really never been done before. I mean, that he's on his knees and he's somehow sliding across, or he's got the guitar on the, like directly on the stage, and he's somehow playing it, and he will probably at some point set it afire.
Right.
I mean, which is, a literalization of exactly what we're talking about. It's very hard to imagine him in a studio recording Electric Ladyland, although that's the way we hear it.
Right. He did those things, set his instrument on fire and all that, and at the same time, he was a composer, an artist, and a reasonable person, like Liszt, Two other things that I really admire about him, even on a single note level, Jimi Hendrix was great. Like the profoundness of one single note is worth slowing down for and thinking about and really absorbing. So, but there's one other application of the word virtuosity, or just a question I have, which is that this word is so roomy and so unfixed that I keep thinking it must be possible for somebody to not be a good musician in a traditional sense.
Yeah.
And be a virtuoso.
No, that's a very interesting question. I think the way that, if I recall, you raised that in the essay, and it made me think about something you and I have talked a little bit about, which is whether you can be a virtuoso of other things that are not musical. I mean, can you be a virtuoso slugger if you play for the Yankees or for the Mets? Probably not for the Mets because you're probably injured. Or if you are the jockey who rides Secretariat, is it a virtuoso performance? Sure, but maybe it's by metaphor. But can you say that you're a virtuoso of horsecraft and of jockeying? Can Secretariat be an equine virtuoso? By the same token, I mean, we talked about this the other day, I think. But I think someone had asked you, can you be a virtuoso of pornography if you're a porn star, if you're especially talented? But
at any rate, that what we're talking about is just grace and the impression of being born to it, and the impression of again, it's not so much that you make it look easy,
Yeah.
but that the musicians I'm interested in have something else, something beyond that, and I don't know what to call that.
Uh-huh.
And I'm not content with calling it virtuosity.
Uh-huh.
And so it's going to be my aspiration to figure out how to write about it in a better way. It's just not going to be good enough to call George Duke a virtuoso and be done with it.
Yeah.
There's something else there.
Uh-huh.
And also virtuoso, it's just, it has too many negative associations, not just for me, but for lots of people.
Yeah. Do you have the same kind of faith that that's something that we should hope to become as listeners? And what would it mean for us to think of ourselves as virtuoso listeners?
I mean, I resist the word virtuoso a little bit, but I think that the kind of listeners that many of us are becoming is the kind where we can synthesize huge amounts of information very quickly. And by that I mean we can think comparatively, because we're listening to so much now. There's some very wide-ranging American poll that was taken a few years ago about listening habits in America that yielded the fact that, like the average American listens to, like 4 hours of music a day. So some incredible amount.
Really, and that includes a jingle on the television during a commercial?
I suppose
or
it includes that. Yeah,
anything. Okay.
Or music that you're listening to while you do the chores or whatever.
Right.
Like, it doesn't have to be directed attention.
Uh-huh.
It's just anything. But still, it gets in there. And I know that I see more and more articles written about, like, all the hits from 2017 sound exactly the same.
Yeah.
And here's why. It compares them formally.
Mm-hmm.
And I never used to see articles written like this.
Yeah.
And I know that when we encounter a musician that we've never heard of before, I'm saying we, and I don't like doing that, but I'm going to keep doing it just a little bit. Like, who is we? But many of us, when we encounter a musician that we've never heard of before for whatever reason, because all of a sudden they pop up in the news or our Twitter feeds or whatever, some of us might say, who is that person? I don't know who that person is. That's a problem because I know everything. I'm supposed to know who that person is. So we find out, and we can find out within 5 minutes the outline of a musician's career. We can click through a sufficient amount of that person's musical output to get the basic idea, the outline. That's a lot. I mean, I think that is the kind of listener that many of us are becoming.
Yeah.
The kind of listener that's able to do something with huge amounts of information.
Yeah. To have to process it in a different way,
Yeah.
but also to be able to store it in a way that we didn't used to store our knowledge about music. Yeah,
and also to think comparatively.
Yeah.
Because we're listening to far more songs per day than we used to.
Do you think that the sort of day that we really think of genres is coming to an end? Or when we think of ourselves as a certain kind of listener, I'm a fan of this sort of music or that sort of music, or I only listen to country western music, or I only listen to bagpipes in the evening.
It's definitely.
Are we reaching a point where you're seeing that maybe among listeners, that they have just much more ecumenical taste?
Well, it's definitely becoming blurrier.
Yeah.
I think genre is important for selling.
Yeah, genre's not really the right term, but
no, but for this for the purposes of this conversation, it's really useful. I'm into the idea of tradition more than I'm into the idea of genre.
Right.
Like, I think genre is a fixed thing for selling, and I think tradition innately, the idea of tradition intrinsically is about growth over time. And I think that as long as there are, okay, let's talk about genre for a second. As long as there are, let's say, hip-hop labels or hip-hop imprimators or whatever selling hip-hop music,
yeah,
then there's still going to be a use for the idea of hip-hop. But if people like that gradually are plowed over by platforms, which I kind of think is going to happen,
right,
then perhaps the idea of genre will recede. Because what's going on right now is that, I mean, think of Spotify. Spotify is your library, is your individual library.
Right.
It's also your universal library. It's also your filing system. It's also your sound system.
Mm-hmm.
It's also your radio. It's also your, it has a certain way of presenting things visually. So it's a graphic design system. It's it's everything.
It's all encompassing.
It's taking every role.
Yeah. And it is a place of intensive self-fashioning, as you mentioned. I mean, it is where you really say, this is my my signature as a consumer of music. What my playlist, the playlist that I construct, the individualized playlists on Spotify, I mean, it's really autobiographical.
Yeah, that's the curating, sharing part.
But also the playlist that I download. If I've got, Berlioz here, it says something about me. And if I have Les McCann, it says something about me. But it's a story you're telling yourself. It's about yourself. I find it really, really amazingly interesting.
Yeah.
But I also wonder, what do you think that says about the future of something like jazz criticism, for example, which I think requires a very intensive knowledge of the history of jazz, of the tradition. We're stepping a little bit away from the question of virtuosity, but I'm curious what you think this might.
Yeah, jazz is funny. It's more like classical music than it is like pop music, in that to understand it responsibly or sufficiently, you have to understand it as like 100-year continuity.
Yeah.
To basically know about jazz of the last 5 years and not really know that much about the past, which is how many young people consume pop music.
Yeah.
And that's fine. It's just the way it goes. I'm not casting aspersions. This is just the way it goes.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't compute for jazz because musicians are coming out of a really long tradition.
Yeah.
And they're always sort of communing with the ancestors.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like it's so much easier to write about jazz when you take the anxiety away.
Uh-huh.
When you put the anxiety there, the anxiety is all you can see.
Mm-hmm.
It's all you can feel. Oh my God, is it gonna end? When's it gonna end? How are we gonna know? What's the sign going to be that it's coming to an end? I mean, I think jazz is changing, and now I'm hearing a lot more jazz that does not sound like the tradition that I used to know. I'm hearing lots of essentially sort of 4-chord loops over and over and over with beats that are basically influenced by Jay Dilla or some kind of acoustic version of a hip-hop concept. Interesting, good, cool, all that, but it's just different.
Mm-hmm.
I still think those musicians are listening to, McCoy Tyner and Duke Ellington and Keith Jarrett and blah, blah, blah. I think that jazz is learned in schools, and they're going to learn those musicians, and they can do what they want with them. Yeah, and maybe it'll all come back or not. But I have one last thought. I want to circle back to the idea of what kind of listeners we may be becoming.
Yeah.
I'm fascinated by the way that there are all these podcasts now which attempt to explain why a particular song is effective and sort of breaks it down to the atom. And so there's this new skepticism of why does this song deserve to be popular?
Right.
Well, we're going to explain it to you in a way that you will understand. And we'll show you that everything comes down to formulas and sort of layers of formula. And also the idea of tropes is just so omnipresent. You ever seen the website tvtropes.org?
No.
It's completely amazing because it breaks down TV shows and films and different kinds of popular entertainment into tropes, and it cites tropes wherever they may occur. And it's a way of thinking about culture that 20 years ago, let's say, basically only, script writers and academics were thinking this way.
Right.
Now everybody seems to be thinking this way. They're spotting tropes from movie to movie. And I think that we're listening to music in that way too. We're spotting conventions from song to song.
That migrate in some kind of way that's a surprise to us.
Yeah.
Or many people tend to think of as surprising.
Right.
When they hear it and when it's shown to them.
It's really analytical.
Yeah.
Maybe somewhat cynical. I don't know. Perhaps it's taking the magic away a little bit or whatever. I don't know. I don't care.
Yeah.
My brain isn't particularly wired that way. But I think that when I think about the future of listening, I think about that a lot.
Yeah. If you were given the opportunity to ban the word virtuoso, would you do so? Does it still do enough labor that we really want to hang on to it?
I'm not into banning language.
Well, I'm not saying you're a language banner.
It's
but
it's worth
if you were
bringing up the question.
king of language for a day, and you could get rid of a few words,
I would just want to send out a bulletin to the people to be sensitized to that word in a way that they hadn't been before, and to question it before they use it unthinkingly.
Uh-huh. Well, I should point out the name of your essay is not against virtuosity, but mere virtuosity.
Right.
And we thank you very much for coming by to speak to us today.
Thanks, Eric.
Okay, Ben, it's great to see you. This podcast has been brought to you by the New York Institute for the Humanities at NYU in conjunction with the Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute. Our producers are Annika Kaundinya and Ben Branstein. Our thanks to Uli Baer and, for their technical and design acumen, Aaron Dowdy and Selena Lucazi. For more information, or if you'd like to subscribe to our podcast, visit our website at, and this is one word, nyihumanities.org. Again, that's nyihumanities.org.